welcome to another episode of Leaders Podcast. Leaders Podcast gives me the unique opportunity to speak to some of the most influential investigative leaders around the globe. And today I'm really honoured to be joined by Rory McMahon, who has been an investigator for over 50 years. Rory is an influential figure based out in the East Coast of the US. I'm going to welcome Rory. Welcome to the show. Thank you for taking the time to speak to me today.
Mike, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm honored to be in this group of people that you've assembled so far.
Thanks so much, Rory. Just so for the people that are listening, just give us a brief introduction of who you are, where you're from, what you're doing now.
Okay, I don't know how brief. Cut me off if I'm going too long. It's been a rather lengthy career. I started in September of 1973. I was appointed a probation officer in Westchester County, which is the county just north of New York. I lived in the city of Yonkers, which again is half an hour north of downtown Manhattan. And I spent 4.5 years working for the county. Enjoyed it, but the caseloads were horrific. I supervised over 100 offenders. Wow. And I transitioned to the federal probation in the United States. The federal courts are divided up into districts. There's 96 judicial districts. And I applied for and was appointed as a probation officer in Manhattan, which is the Southern District of New York. Yep. And what was favorable about that was that my caseload was no larger than 35 people, which is very manageable. I enjoyed the work very much. Not crazy about the commute from Yonkers down to the city every day by train and subway and whatnot. But I kind of worn out my welcome by 1982. I had a little bit of a dust up with the chief probation officer. Myself and some other individuals in the office were not happy with his leadership styles. And when they did a nationwide hunt and appointed the deputy chief as the new chief, I realized that the environment would probably not be too great for me. So I transferred to the Southern District of Florida, which is Miami. Now, Miami at that time, we're talking about, Fidel Castro had emptied out his prisons and his mental health institutions and any other undesirables that he had, and he shipped them over to Miami, which was 90 miles away by boat from Cuba. Mm-hmm. And here I am coming from New York. I thought that I had experienced everything, and there were no surprises on the horizon. Well, I went from the mean streets of New York to the wild, wild west of Miami back in the early 1980s. I mean, between all of the Cuban, exiles coming in, and also the Colombian drug cartels that were controlling it, it was unbelievable. I mean, I would walk down the street and see these 18-year-old kids with, gold Coke spoons around their neck, driving Lamborghinis and Ferraris and you name it, driving cigarette boats and just like in your face with how much illegal activity was going on. I mean, those were the days when, these bad guys, these drug dealers would walk into a bank with suitcases filled with $100 bills or boxes filled with $100 bills and just, get carte blanche from these banks that they couldn't handle this avalanche of cash that was there. So and at that time, Southern District of Florida was a very small or middle-sized district. And within 3 years of my being there, it became the second largest district in the country. So we had a massive influx of officers that were transferred in and that were hired. Now, during the first year that I was there, I was assigned to the Miami office, which is the headquarters. And I was living in Broward County, which is where Fort Lauderdale is. So it was a commute. It was an ugly commute again in the morning, this time in my car as opposed to a train. But the thing about Miami during that time was everywhere I went when I left the office, 90+% of the people did not speak English, and I did not speak Spanish.
Right.
So I had to have a probation officer assistant who was fluent in Spanish come with me every time I left the office if I was, going to be doing an interview or with people. And around that same time, we had a new chief that came in, and it was a young, aggressive guy from Texas. And I got friendly with him. They did an evaluation of the office and whatnot, and he talked to a lot of the officers. And I was a pretty outspoken guy, so he could trust that he was going to get the real story from me.
Yeah.
And we got to be very friendly. And so when he became appointed the chief, I went in and said, Carlos, me working in Miami is not, doesn't work for anybody. I can't even go out of the office without being accompanied by somebody. I would much prefer to work in Fort Lauderdale where they speak my language. I live up there, it'd be a much easier commute.
Yeah.
So that, in fact, is what happened. And at the same time, he created a specialized unit called the Special Offender Unit, which supervised career criminals. And there was no shortage of career criminals in South Florida during that time. There has always been, a large collection of fraudsters that go there because they can operate anywhere in the world. So why not operate in American's playground, with the rich and the famous? But in addition to that, you had a lot of mobsters that I was familiar with, organized crime people from New York and Chicago and Philadelphia that would have houses down there or, would have interactions with groups down there. And then you had the drug cartels. So that's what our job was, to supervise these people. And there was no pretense of, there's going to be any attempt at rehabilitation or whatnot. These were career criminals. And for the sake of your audience, what a probation officer is basically if someone is convicted of a crime and they're, a young offender or, they've never had any really serious crimes before, they get placed on probation instead of going to jail so that they're supervised in the community and they have a list of conditions that they must abide by. Otherwise, they could be given the sentence that they faced at the time of the initial sentencing. So, the conditions include things like don't commit any new crimes, you can't use drugs, you have to work, you have to report to your probation officer. So things of that nature. Now, in the federal system, I supervised parolees. Now, parolees are people that are sentenced to jail and then they come out either early, on parole, or in the federal system, they created a parole system for these serious offenders that would be added on to their parole after they completed their parole. So routinely, it would be a 5-year term. So you'd get out of jail 2 years early, be on parole for 2 years, and then a special parole would kick in. And same conditions for them as for probation. And if they violated, they get sent back and they have to finish out their term. So if they're on regular parole, they would finish out the 2 years. They would be released and then finish out the 5 years. And if they violated that, they could go back for whatever, period of time the judge deemed appropriate. So it was an incredible time to be there. And I flourished. I had never been so happy in my life. First of all, I was living in paradise, great weather, no winters like we had in New York. Had a young and aggressive, chief and leadership. Was in a perfect place for me because I was a law enforcement kind of guy, not like a social worker type. And I really, found my niche, and I very quickly became a leader within the unit. I was appointed a specialist, supervising organized crime people, and I set out a national program where anybody that had organized crime ties from any city in the country they would have to check in with me because I wanted to alert. I was plugged into Department of Justice Strike Force, which is the prosecutors for in the federal system. I was also a member of a group of organized crime, federal, state, and local people. And what they would do for me is they were an intelligence gathering group, and they would actually go out and supervise, my guys. I mean, surveil them, so they could report back to me who they were associating with, or what type of activities they were involved in. And then in return, I would use those officers or agents to testify and to revoke the supervision of these individuals. So it worked out very well for 4 or 5 years. And during my entire career, starting in with county probation, I've always been somebody that's very entrenched in professional associations.
Right.
When I worked for Westchester County, I was very active in the Probation and Parole Officers Association of New York. When I got to the federal district in Southern District, New York, I was part of the Federal Probation Officers Association, and a group of us actually created a tri-district chapter. It was District of New Jersey, the Southern District of New York, and the Eastern District of New York. New York County and New York City has 5 boroughs, and half of the boroughs were in the Eastern District and the other were in the Southern District where I worked. So basically, you got the people that were very entrenched and were making a career out of this and would become the future leaders, hopefully, of these organizations. So that trend continued when I moved to Miami. As a matter of fact, I got elected as the secretary of the National Association. We would meet, once a year in Washington, D.C., and then we would have meetings, around the country. And I actually created a training group and hosted the first national training conference put on by the Federal Probation Officers Association. It was in Hollywood, Florida, which is Broward County, where I lived. And officers from around the country, as well as the local probation office from the state, attended, and we had speakers coming from all over the country, a lot of big names and whatnot. Went very well. And then around 1987, I ran into a little hiccup in the road. Kind of my boss became more of a regular boss and lost his aggressive attitude and kick-ass supervision is what he referred to it as and wanted more, the calm water type that I was used to from, the bureaucratic agencies. They don't want anybody that's making any ripples. They want a calm lake. So very quickly, there became, issues. And it culminated. I had some major drug traffickers, one of whom was a guy by the name of Ben Kramer. And Kramer was while he was on supervision, he was smuggling in freighter loads of drugs from Colombia. Now, I knew he was doing this because I was getting the intelligence from the federal and local law enforcement agencies. And 3 times I tried to violate his parole, but he was so locked in, both politically and with attorneys and a lot of influential people in South Florida and the country. There was a U.S. senator in California that claimed that he had financed Kramer had this marina in Miami called Fort Apache Marina. And he claimed he was an employee there. But in actuality, he owned it. I mean, he said his father owned it and this guy in California. So a long story short, another famous boat builder on that same street where Kramer's was a guy by the name of Don Aronow, who invented the cigarette boat. And they kind of had, originally, Aronow was his mentor, and then they had a falling out. And Aronow was gunned down in 1987 while he was parked outside of the Apache Marina. As a matter of fact, that day, the chief called me up and he goes, I think your boy Kramer was involved with this. And I said, I agree with you. I've reached out to the homicide detectives from Miami-Dade, and I'm still waiting for a call back. Well, they never called me. Nobody ever called me. So, and then I heard through the grapevine that, they had ruled out Kramer. Now, other than his family and his friends, the person that spent more time with Ben Kramer than anybody else was me. And I was the only law enforcement officer that had regular contact. And when I say regular, I mean at least once a week, sometimes 3 and 4 times a week. The most amazing thing about Ben Kramer was when he came to the office, he was the only person that I ever had under supervision that was allowed to bring his attorney with him. Now, needless to say, the attorney sitting in the room with you, I'm not getting, answers to questions, to the important questions. The attorney's deflecting. So to make a long story short, I ended up working with a guy that was writing a book on the murder of Aronow. All signals that he was getting pointed to Ben Kramer being involved, and he was told by the prosecutor's office and by an IRS agent and a DEA agent who had a task force looking at Kramer, that I was the guy to talk to if he wanted any information on Kramer. I talked to him. I had routinely talked to press in the past, but when his book came out in 1990, it was a book called Blue Thunder. The rubber hit the road, and they did not like some of the things I was quoted in the book as saying, and I lost my job as a federal probation officer in October of 1990. Now, little did I know that would turn out to be the best thing that ever happened to me, because within a month, I became licensed as a private investigator in Florida. I also was offered and started teaching at a college that was training people to be private investigators. And a year after I was hired to start teaching at this school, it became accredited by the state of Florida and actually offered an associate's degree with a major in private investigation. So many things that I didn't know about being a private investigator, that I didn't learn, in my career in law enforcement, I learned while I was teaching these classes. So, and the other thing is, I was an English major when I was in college. I graduated in 1972. I thought I was going to be a high school English teacher. Well, the Vietnam War was going on, and you could get a deferment if you were a teacher. Now, I didn't have to worry about the draft. I was in the lottery system, and my number was not called. So, but I couldn't get a job. And my dad, who was born in 1920, and lived through the Depression, said, and he spent his career, he said, government is always a good place. So, and he said, I happen to know somebody that's a deputy, chief in Westchester County probation, and I can hook you up with an interview. I said, I mean, at that point in time, Mike, I didn't even know what a probation officer was. I had never experienced it, didn't know anybody that was on probation. But, things happened. I took the job, liked it, didn't like having 100 people because you could have no impact. But so I get fired from my federal probation job. The only thing I think that I can do is be an investigator. I know how to do interviews. I know how to research records. I can, at least have a starting basis. And I've done surveillance. So those are the 3 main, tools that an investigator needs. And it just, it worked out fantastically. I am just so happy. I can't imagine doing another job where I would be as happy as I have been in this job. So I'll cut that short. So that pretty much is a thumbnail of what got me here, and minus the educational stuff. That's pretty much what it is.
I've got loads of questions for you, Rory. Thank you for that. That's fascinating. So you came out into the private sector, started investigating with the skills that you developed in the public sector. What was back then? What was the biggest challenge and difference for you then? because you're starting out on your own, right? It's not easy, for the new guys coming
Oh,
out and starting.
tell me about it. Mike. I was used to getting paid every 2 weeks, whether I worked 40 hours or I worked
Yeah,
20 hours. Now I'm an aggressive, alpha male type. I didn't work 40 hours. I worked 60 hours,
yeah,
and so that was never a problem. Coming into the office at 8:30, when I'm working till 9:30 at night, that became an issue. Yeah.
yeah,
So I showed up at 9 o'clock. Yeah, but what about the 4 hours after 5 o'clock that I'm working?
yeah,
Those types of things. But to answer your question, it was starting a business, which I
mm,
had no experience doing, marketing myself, no experience doing, and running a business. The actual investigative part of the job, that was never a problem or an issue. But I mean, even to this day, I hate the paperwork. When I was a probation officer, I hated the paperwork. I could write reports and I could write violations and stuff to go into court, but the mundane, filling out, reports in triplicate for the bosses and, never my thing.
yeah.
So those were the key issues.
You make a good point there. There's some excellent investigators out there, but they're not very good at running a business. And you need, and in this industry, if you're working for yourself in the private sector, you need to have an understanding of both, right?
Right.
Maybe, maybe it's the associations that you can get support from. Talk to me about your journey in associations and why why you joined associations. What benefits do you get out of them, and why would you go down that road as well?
First of all, training. They were always a good opportunity for training. In Westchester County, I wanted to meet other people that worked in the field. I mean, I was in an office, um, and I wasn't in the main office. Or the main office was in White Plains. I was in Yonkers, which was a big city, but
Mm,
I wanted to see how other people, particularly because of the problems I was having with this high volume caseload, with people in Rockland County and in Albany and Buffalo and in other cities. So a statewide association put me in contact with people, not just in my own little county, but other counties. And I viewed them as the leadership of the community, of this
mm,
probation community. Um, Same thing when I got to, I probably within 6 months of my being appointed a federal probation officer in New York City, I became a member of the Federal Association.
yep.
Within a year, I was one of the active members and on the board of this tri-district chapter that we created. So, um, and again, I welcomed the opportunity. We would go down to the annual meeting they would have every March in Washington, D.C., and we would actually go into the halls of Congress and lobby for issues that would impact, us as probation officers. So it would, being in the federal system, it was a huge, awakening to, the vast system. And I had particular issues that concerned me. Here I was working in Harlem, which is one of the
Mm,
highest crime areas in New York City. I worked in the South Bronx, which was the second highest. And they sent me out there with not 1 minute of safety training, and we were not allowed to carry weapons.
wow.
So one of my pitches, I would get down there and meet all of these, muckety mucks the administrative office of the U.S. courts oversaw the probation system. And the first question that I would ask them was, "What are you doing to protect me while I'm a probation officer working in New York City?"
Yeah.
And let me tell you, I told my wife, if something happens to me on the job, the first thing she needs to do is file a lawsuit against the Southern District of New York and the administrative office of the U.S. courts. Well, I made that journey down to Washington 5 or 6 times. A very good friend of mine who used to work in the D.C. office and then went to work for them. Uh, he met with me one time before our meeting with them, and he goes, "Rory, every year when you come down, there's a meeting and they go, who's going to handle McMahon and his question about training? And he goes, the bad news is it's me that's going to be handling. So I said, you know the drill.
Yeah.
I mean, this is insanity. I mean, not 1 minute. So I'm glad to say I got to Florida. They allowed us to, they trained us, you know. So, but while that was going on, while I was on my watch in New York, there was a probation officer that was shot and killed by one of his parolees. He was
Gee.
in Kentucky or I forget where, but you know, so it did happen. But I mean, those are the types of issues I want to have input, not just on the local level. I want to
Yeah.
and training. You know, the guy in New York, the training coordinator, told me, he goes, every memo I send out announcing some kind of a training opportunity, I can always count that you're going to respond. And I said to him, Tommy, if the government is going to pay for me to go to Washington or to go to, and they don't have these in Boise, Idaho, they have these in great places, but
Yeah.
it's incredible training. I mean, and I also avail myself. I fly in the weekend before. I stay the weekend after on my dime. But if they're going to fly me up there and pay for me to be there, you know, I'm going to get
Yeah.
trained and be a better probation officer, and I'm going to enjoy myself. You know, I was single for a lot of those years, so it worked out well. But and especially, you know, once I got to in the private sector, I mean, I would go to these conferences,
Yeah.
and you know, there's all these database services. There's all these ancillary services that we need that you know, the people that I'm, you know, in contact with aren't familiar with all of them. So I learned firsthand. I would sit down with them, explain this to me, and you know, all of these different databases, and you know, I learned firsthand.
Yeah. Fantastic, Rory. Tell me, Rory, what would be the biggest? What do you consider the biggest achievement that you've made in your 51-year career, or over 50 years as an investigator?
I have always education has always been near and dear.
Hmm.
I was referred to because I was teaching this at this school for 7 years. And I would bring the students to the professional association meetings. I would bring them to the conferences. I mean, not bring them, you know, and because I felt if they were going into the field, why not expose them to the
Yeah.
agency owners who are going to hire them? That the agency owners see these guys are really trained and know what they're doing. Um, so they kind of refer to me as the education PI. But
Hmm.
you know, I also think that I was fortunate. I had some incredibly high profile, fascinating cases that I worked over the years. I mean, so much so that, you know, I spent the last year writing a book about these different cases. I mean, most of them have had books written about them. Some of them have had movies written about them.
Oh,
I mean,
wow.
one guy that I supervised, Barry Seal, Tom Cruise played him in a movie called American Made. And of course, you know, Hollywood didn't get the story right. Um, but, you know, so I was an aggressive PI, but I wanted to make the profession better. When I started in
Mm.
1990, there was a lot of sketchy people.
Yep.
Um, and I actually think the OJ case actually improved the profile of investigators after that. Um, so you know, I always I was always available to answer questions from either former students or people new to the field, you know, to get them the training they needed to be professional investigators.
Yeah. Fantastic, Rory. What's the name of your book, Rory, that you've written?
The most recent one, I
Yep.
wrote a couple of books while I was teaching that were geared towards to actually, you know, teaching the classes, because when I started in 1990, there were no books. Those books are, and they're 3 editions, Practical Handbook for Professional Investigators. Um, but the book about my career, which just came out earlier this year, is called Fort Apache, Real Story of Ben Darth Vader Kramer, who was this
Brilliant.
international drug smuggler. And I also talk about my other high profile cases, you know, Barry Seal. And I also worked on the Liberty City 7 case, which was The government said that they were, Al-Qaeda operatives. They were no more an Al-Qaeda operatives than you or I are, Mike.
Right.
These were 7 Haitian individuals that were targeted and railroaded by the FBI informants. And it was a travesty.
Oh, that's terrible. Details of Rory's books coming up on the screen now. You can click through and you can find out more information there. That's great. Fantastic. So, Rory, I just want to finish up on, because there's so much I could talk to you about actually, but I just want to finish up on some takeaways. In your opinion, having worked your extensive career for the public and then coming out into the private sector, your passion, I can hear it in your voice in terms of training and upskilling. What makes someone a strong, effective, and efficient leader?
Number one would be you have to want it. You have to see the system and say it's not as good as it should be, and I'm not going to leave it to somebody else. I'm going to join the fight and lead the fight if I have to. So you have to want it, and then you have to walk the walk and talk the talk. You have to, be willing to go out there and do the things that are necessary to improve the system or whatever it is you're trying to accomplish. You have to go down to Washington to convince the policymakers or whoever it is. But most importantly, you have to talk truth to power. I had a problem with that my entire career. One of my mentors and good friends told me, he said, Rory, you look to take a fight on every cause. Think of yourself as the Lone Ranger. You only have 6 silver bullets, so use them wisely. The way you operate, you need a machine gun. So, and I can't say that I always took his advice, but I got the message. You're more effective if you can concentrate on some of the things that need the most attention. Let the other ones get handled by somebody else.
Rory, it's been a pleasure speaking to you. Rory's contact details are coming up on the screen. You listen to another episode of Leaders Podcast. Thank you very much, Rory.
Thank you very much, Mike. I appreciate it.